called easing and gathering. So I have an example of each of those here. This is an example of gathers. So if you look at it, something probably familiar to you if you've worked with or used women's wear or even girls' clothing, something very common, something like ruffles or tiers often have this sample technique, which is called gathering. This is something that, again, comes off as very feminine. It's an example of added fullness. So what we're doing is we're taking fabric and we're creating this movement with it. We're giving it different shape. We're adding this extra fullness with these big wrinkles and middle pleating that's happening here. This is called gathering. Again, very common on women's wear or on girls' clothing. It is sewn in the exact same way as the second sample, which is called easing. Well, now this looks very different. So if you look at this one, if you look really closely, you can see little tiny waves in the material. So actually the easing and the gathering are actually sewn in the same way, except the easing has less additional fullness. So there's less extra fabric. What we've done is we've taken two smaller pieces and we've sewn them together with larger pieces. One of them you can tell that it was a larger piece because it was vastly larger. It was a few inches larger for sure. Where this one was just a little bit larger, but we've still been able to connect them smooth along the seam line, and you can see there that that's what creates this matching seam here. Okay, so that's going to be the hard part for these samples. The hard part is going to be just making sure that the raw edges of the seam match each other, and that's the whole purpose of them. Gathering, again, is something that we're going to do where you're going to see it. We're going to use a much larger piece, and we're going to create these wrinkles or ruffles, pleats. Here with the easing, it's going to be a larger piece down here, but it's not going to be as large, and we're not going to be able to see big wrinkles or ruffles or anything happening down here. This is common in tons of different garments. This is something that you see in almost all sleeves. When we have what's called a set-in sleeve, which you'll do within the next couple of weeks for a sample. A set-in sleeve has this process done along the sleeve cap. And the reason why that happens is because with a sleeve cap, you have the top of the sleeve and then the armhole, which is an oval. They're not exactly the same shape, so you have to get something that's a little bit bigger to fit into a smaller area. Okay? So easing is really common in a lot of different areas of garments. Gathering, very popular on women's wear. So, in order to do these samples, you're going to take two pieces of 3x6, so very similar to the ones we use for seams. So 2 pieces of 3x6, and then you're going to take one piece, so 2 pieces of 3x6 there, and then you're going to take one piece, of a 3x10, a 3x11, a 3x12, just a 3 by something bigger. So you're going to need a larger piece. This larger piece is going to be for the gathering. And then you're going to need one sample that's a 3x6 1/4. Okay, so that's this one here. I've already started to work on the sample, so that one has a few stitches in it. Okay, so in order to do these samples, you can essentially do them both at the same time. You can kind of work your way through like an assembly line. So the ones that are the 3x6s, those ones I'm going to call those these are the control pieces. So I'm going to take those and I'm just going to set them aside because I don't need to use them quite yet. So I'm going to pop those aside, and I'm going to leave out my 3x10, and I'm going to leave in my 3x6 1/2 or 3x6 1/4. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by applying 2 rows of basting. So if you look at my smaller piece here, I've already stitched in those rows of basting. So what I've done is I've stitched in a row of basting at 1/2 inch and another row of basting at 3/4 inch. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see that a little better. So make sure it's focused. So you can see that I have a row of basting at 3/4 inch and at 1/2 inch. The reason why I've created 2 rows of basting, 1 at half and 1 at 3/4, is because we use the seam allowance of 5/8. 5/8 is right in between 1/2 inch and 3/4. So I'm just going to slide that over, and you can see there's 5/8. So when we go to stitch this, our stitch should land right in the middle of these 2 rows of basting. So this basting is going to be used to help us to fit the larger pieces to the smaller ones. So remember, bastings are a long length, so there are 5 in their length, 0 in their width because it's just a straight line, and you want to make sure that you're leaving these nice long thread chains. The reason why you want to make sure that you're leaving a long thread chain is because we're going to come eventually and we're going to take the spool threads only, we're going to leave our bobbin threads down, and we're going to tug on these. And you'll see that when I start to tug on just the spool threads, it starts to wrinkle up. And that's essentially the process that we're doing for this sample. So you want to make sure that when you're basting, when you're putting those 2 rows of bastings in, make sure you're leaving these nice long thread chains. Okay, so I'll go ahead and add 2 rows of basting to my longer piece, and then you can see how I've left those long chains. So I'm going to go ahead, sorry, camera's going to move. Okay, so I'm going to crank my machine up, so I can get it in frame for you. The length is here, and I'm going to take it all the way up to a 5. So I know it's hard to see. I'm going to crank that all the way to a 5. Okay, so now my length is really long. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay my fabric under my foot, and I'm not going to use, let's guide out again, I'm not going to use my 5/8, which is my taped line or my, Sharpie line or my stitch plate line that says it. I'm not going to use 5/8. I'm going to use 1/2 inch, which is right before it, and then I'm going to use 3/4 of an inch, which is the line right after. Okay, so I'm going to do my first one at 1/2 inch, and I'm going to make sure that I've got a little bit of thread hanging off the end of it. That way I have a thread chain to hold on to. And I'm going to make sure that I start at the very end because I'm going to want to make sure that the whole thing gets gathered. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I stitch all the way from the very end. Once you have a couple stitches in, you can let go of the threads. And you might find that the machine starts to kind of gather without your, doing. And that's okay. It's just kind of what this basting stitch tends to do. It tends to start to gather on its own, so that's okay if it does it. You can see that mine's already starting to unravel, so I'm going to trim those a tiny bit, but that's why we want to finish our seams all the time. I'm going to go ahead and remove it from the machine, and I'm going to leave myself a nice long thread chain, and then I'm going to clip it down here. So there's my single row, first row basting. Now I'm going to do a second row, and this time I'm going to do it at 3/4, which is just to the right of 5/8, so just next to it, just a little bit bigger. And I'm going to go ahead and leave a nice long chain. I'm not going to backstitch because this is temporary, so remember no backstitching when it comes to basting. And I'm doing the 3/4, just past 5/8. And again, mine's fraying a little bit, so I'm going to trim mine up just a hair because it's fraying quite a bit. Pull it out, leaving a nice long chain. And bring this back up. Okay, so I'm just going to trim off just the tiniest bit of my frayed ends. Okay, so again, 2 rows of bastings, 1 at 1/2, 1 at 3/4, nice long thread chains. Same thing on my other larger piece, 1 at 1/2, 1 at 3/4, nice long thread. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to work with my easing first. So I'm going to go ahead and take my large sample, and I'm going to set it aside. And I'm going to grab one of my control pieces, so one of my smaller pieces. So one of my 3x6s. Okay? So I have a pretty side to this fabric. Kind of looks kind of faded on the back. And then I have a pretty side to this fabric. Again, looks kind of faded on the back. What I want to do is I want to put the fabrics pretty side together, and I want to seam them. But if I go to do that, if I go to put them pretty sides together, oh no, this one's bigger by 1/2 inch. Oh, that's right. It's a larger piece. We're going to ease it together. So working with this size of fabric, it's kind of a big area. So one of the things that I like to do when I'm easing and gathering is I like to split up my sample piece or my shirt piece or my collar or whatever it is that I'm using. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold my control piece, my smaller piece, I'm going to fold it in half, and I'm going to take my scissors and I'm going to make a really small little snip here, like a 1/4 inch snip at the most. Okay? So that tells me where the halfway point of my smaller piece is. I'm going to do the same thing on my larger piece. So I'm going to take out all the wrinkles out of this. I'm going to fold it in half. And I'm going to make a little snip right at the halfway point. No bigger than 1/4 of an inch. Okay. So when I open this up, there's my halfway point. So what I want to do, just like I always do when I'm seaming, I want to take my pretty sides of the fabric and I want them to touch. So I have the pretty side of the larger piece here that has the bastings, and I'm going to take the pretty side of my smaller piece and I'm going to put them touching each other. And I'm going to match, instead of the sides, I'm going to match that little clip that I just made in both of them. So if I connect the clips and kind of fan that, okay, they're right on top of each other. I'm going to pin that with the raw edge touching. So with the raw edge of the fabric touching and the notches matching, I'm now going to pin right in the middle of my sample pieces. Okay? Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to pin the raw edges on the corner together. So I'm going to back this up a little bit and I'm going to match them. Even though I know that they don't match perfectly, I'm going to force them to match along the corner there. And then I'm going to pin that together. So what you will find is that there's a little gap up here. That one of the pieces is bigger than the other and you're getting this extra fabric. Well, that's fine. That's what it should do. I'm going to do the same thing over here. I'm going to match the edges together and I'm going to pin that. Okay. Again, same thing. Open this up and you're like, oh no, it's too big. That's okay. We need to ease it. Okay, so now what I'm going to do, I'm going to come to the back side. I'm going to come to the side that's bigger. And I'm going to, like I said before, I'm going to grab a hold of some of the threads. Not all of the threads. Do not grab all 4. Don't grab all 4. You only want to grab either the bobbin threads or the spool threads, but not both. So I'm separating. I'm getting the bobbin threads away from the spool threads, separating them. Okay, I'm going to leave the bobbin ones to themselves, and I'm going to take the spool threads. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to slowly pull on the threads while I hold the fabric and kind of pull the fabric away from the thread. And you'll see what it does is it starts to create these little wrinkles. And with an ease, you really don't need a lot. So that right there is plenty to get them to fit to be the same size. So what you're going to do once you have it, the size that you want, you can take your basic threads and you can kind of just loop them up so they don't go flying all over the place. And what you want to do is you want to smooth out with the ease. You want to make it so there's no wrinkles or ruffles or pleats or gathers. You simply want the fabric to almost have just like a wave to it. You don't want to see anything dramatic, nothing big, no floppy stitches or fabric folding over each other. Just this very subtle wrinkle. Once you have that nice, pretty subtle wrinkle, go ahead and put a couple extra pins in, maybe another pin every 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch or so. So you'll end up with about 4 or 5 pins in there. Okay? Now you can see, oh, they fit each other now. There are little wrinkles or waves in it, but there's nothing large. Nothing that's going to get stitched on and it's going to get flattened and turned into a pleat. Now I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to take my threads. I'm not going to grab all 4 of them. I'm going to separate them so that I can grab, this is kind of knotted, sorry. I'm going to grab just the bobbins or just the spools. So I've got my 2 spool threads there, my 2 bobbin threads here, I'm going to grab my spool threads and I'm slowly going to tug just on the pink fabric, just enough so that they become the same size. That's even too much right there. Once they're the same size, once they're the right size to fit, then you can take the threads, all four of them, you can kind of just wrap them around your pin just to get them out of the way. And again, you're going to use your fingernails, you're going to use your finger to very carefully ease the fabric. And that's why it's called easing, because it's just very smooth and flat. It's eased in. We're not forcing it in. We're not gathering it in, giving these really noticeable wrinkles or ruffles. We're just smooth, controlled, changing the shape a little. Okay, so that is ready to stitch. Okay, so I'm just going to get kind of threads out of the way. Go ahead and leave your basted stitches in for now. I'm now going to flip this over again one more time. If I look at this side now, I don't see any more basting, and I don't see the wrinkling or the ruffling that's happening from the easing, but I can see that, oh, same size here, it's not, going over the edge. Oh, same size here, it's not going over the edge. Oh, my raw edges are even. I don't see any exposed fabric from underneath. So now I'm going to take this to the sewing machine, and I'm going to stitch it. I'm going to stitch it at 5/8, okay? And the reason why I'm flipping it upside down so that I'm looking at the flat portion of the fabric, it's because it's kind of like when you carry a cup of liquid. When you're carrying a cup of liquid, if you, let's say it's a cup full of water with no ice, if it's full to the brim and you watch it and you walk, you tend to spill, you tend to overcorrect. So in order to avoid that, we want the machine to do the work. So again, on the machine, we have those things that are called feed dogs, and we have a presser foot. So we want these little feed dogs, and we want this presser foot to do all the work for us. So we're not going to look at the easing. We're going to put that face down on the machine, and we're going to let the machine do all the work for us. Okay, so now I'm going to take my basting down. I'm going to go back to a regular seam because I'm going to be back stitching. I'm going to be stitching at 5/8 now, so I want to make sure that I'm stitching from the very edge, and then I'm back stitching with my pin. Okay, again, keeping all the threads at the back. I'm going to go ahead and stitch a few, back stitch, go ahead and remove my pins as I get to it, watching that 5/8 line. And again, I'm just letting the machine do the work for me. I don't need to pay attention because I've already pinned it super well. Hopefully everything turns out great because the feed dogs and the presser foot are working together to make a very nice smooth seam. Watching that 5/8, pulling my pins out as I get to them because I don't want to break my needle. Just making sure that everything stays lined up over here. Almost at the end, making sure the threads are out of the way. Pin, stitching to the very edge, and back stitching. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and lift this up one more time. Go ahead and cut this short. Hopefully I don't cut the threads. I'm trying to leave the basic threads in. We'll see if I didn't just snip them. Okay, so if you look carefully, I know it's a little hard to see, but the black thread is my thread that was on my machine just now, and the brown thread is the basting here and the basting here. Now because I stitched right in the middle, my black, hopefully, thank goodness, did not overlap the gray, which means that now that I've stitched my easing and it looks pretty smooth, there is one wrinkle here that I want to get out. So if I can't do it with the iron, I'll go ahead and do it, I'll rip it. But if you look now, oh, it looks pretty good. It doesn't look like there's really any wrinkles there. So again, if you were able to miss your basted rows, you should now be able to grab hold of those and pull them out with ease. So I'm just going to move this out, moving that. There's one row of basting gone. And then I'm going to do the same thing. I did accidentally snip that one, so I can't grab hold of that one, but I can take the other side, and I can grab that, pull on it slowly, release that basted row, and then I'm just going to clip this one last thread. Okay, so now I have my easing sample almost complete. So if I open this up, you'll see again, oh yeah, there aren't any really noticeable wrinkles. It's just a little bit wavy. And these ends are the same, but these ends are quite different in size. So if you look, they're a good ½ an inch different. So once you get to this point, instead of doing what we normally do, where we press this open, we take our iron and we kind of just smash it, instead of doing it that way, what I want you to do is I want you to press it open by putting the weight primarily on the flat side, the one without the easing and gathering. The reason why we do this for easing and gathering is because we don't really want to smash the shape that's happening over here, but we still want to open up that seam. So once you open it up enough so that the outside looks pretty, go ahead and take both seams and then press them together up towards the smaller piece, towards that control piece. Okay, so you're going to watch your fingers because it's going to be hot and your finger's going to be in there. Go ahead and press that. Mine's not on, so. But once it's pressed, and yours will be nice and flat because yours will be plugged in, mine's not plugged in. You want to press it towards the smaller piece. And that's because we want this ease side to be able to fall and lay really flat on its own. So just like we do with any other seam, we don't want to leave this edge raw. But because there's extra bulk in here, because of the wrinkling that's happening, to eliminate a little bit of bulk, we're going to seam finish these together. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to show that to you now. I'm going to switch out my foot. I'm going to go ahead and go to my overcast stitch, which is a number 4 on my machine. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stitch these. I'm going to do a seam finish at the same time together. So I'm going to do it with this seam completely connected. And again, I'm doing them together so that it's less bulky. We don't want a lot of bulk because we have extra fabric. So to eliminate that extra weight in the seam, I'm going to go ahead and seam finishing these as one. And so, okay, so this is kind of like the crotch seam of the pants where we did it together for string. I've seam finished them together, and because the pink one with a little bit of wrinkling in it, with a little bit of waves, is my larger piece, I'm going to push the seam allowance up, and I'm going to give it one good final press up towards the smaller piece. Okay? And that's, again, so if you look at the sample piece that's already done, that's what the sample should look like. You should have your larger piece with the seam pressed up towards the smaller piece with the seams finished seamed together. Okay, so that's what we just did there. And you're going to do the exact same thing for the larger one. So again, this is the sample here. I've got my control here. If I fold it in half, I'm going to make a little snip at the halfway point, which I've already done. So I've got my little snip right there. If I take my larger piece and I fold that in half, and I make a little snip with my scissors, and I've got that already ready to go, I'm going to do the exact same thing where I take pretty side of the fabric and I match it to the pretty side of the fabric, and I'm going to start by pinning them in the center. I'm going to put a pin there where the little notches match each other, and then I'm going to do the same thing like I did in the easing where I match the raw edges on the corner. Even though this doesn't feel right, it feels like there's a lot of extra fabric. That's okay. I'm going to pin that there too. Same thing on the other side. Wow, look at all that extra fabric. It's crazy. Same thing over here. All this extra fabric. I'm going to make sure that the edges are even. They are there. Pin that together. Okay. Same. Wow, look at how much extra fabric there is. So now I'm going to flip it over to the side that's bigger because I obviously have to work on that side. And what I'm going to do is I am going to, sorry, I'm switching my foot back again. I'm going to go ahead and grab a hold of, again, just my spool or just my bobbin threads. Just the bottoms or just the tops. I'm going to grab these spool threads. I'm going to leave the bobbin ones to themselves. And I'm going to take this and I'm going to start to tug. So I'm going to start to pull slowly. And this one is going to have much more pulling and way more wrinkles and gathers, and it's going to look very different than the easing because, again, this one it's supposed to be noticeable. Remember, this one you want it. You want to see this. Okay, so that makes them the same, but, ooh, this is kind of spaced out right here. There aren't very many. Let me say, just focus. It feels like there's a whole lot of gathers here, because look, I have this big wrinkle right here, but then there's nothing over here. So then what you want to do, use your fingers, kind of space these out as best you can, so that again, you're not getting all the wrinkles in one location, you're able to spread them out. And then what you want to do, maybe I loosened it up a little too much, I'm going to tighten this up here again. Then what you want to do is you want to make sure that when you're pinning these, that you're still making sure that the raw edges are even. Don't let this slip down and pin it. You want to make sure that everything is even. Raw edges are even, and then you're going to pin. Okay, I'm going to pin there. Again. Making sure that those are even, and I'm going to pin again. Okay, so now if I look at those, oh yeah, those now fit, where this side is still gigantic. So again, I'm going to come over here. Again, I'm not going to take all 4 threads. I'm going to simply use my pin to separate the bottoms from the tops, and I'm going to take the top threads here and leave the bottom ones down. And I'm going to just hold those 2 rows, those 2 threads, and I'm going to pull and pull and pull until they're the same size, which that's about the same size. Now again, it's looking a little flat here and a little crazy here, so I'm just going to space these out. Use my fingers to kind of push and pull and push and pull. And once I get them even, I'm going to make sure that the tops are aligned. Okay, and I'm going to pin these in place. I'm going to pin here. Excuse me, sorry. And I'm going to pin here. Okay, laying everything nice and flat. Let me zoom out a little. Okay, now it's looking like everything's even. I'm seeing some really nice symmetrical wrinkles or gathers or ruffles. And then I'm going to do the same thing that I did on the easing. I'm going to flip it this way. And I'm going to feed it into the machine. And I'm going to stitch it at 5/8. And I'm not going to look at the wrinkles or the gathers while I'm sewing. I'm just going to stitch at 5/8, making sure that I backstitch, regular seam all the way through, okay? So when it comes out, it's going to look like this without the seam finish. It's going to come out with, a raw edge, but oh, we're going to have this beautiful set of ruffles. And again, I want to press it open on the flat side so we don't smash the wrinkles. And then I'm going to press them both, the seam allowances both up towards the smaller piece. And I'm going to take them and I'm going to seam finish them as one, which I've done here. So, same exact process. I'm not going to go through this one completely because I just did it on the easing. So same exact processes to get your gathering and your easing complete. And then when you're done, you should have these beautiful finished edges, seam finished together with the seams pressed up towards the smaller pieces. And I would love for you to upload 4 pictures for me. One of the inside so that I can see the gathering, and then the smaller piece with the finish. And then one from the pretty side, the right side of the fabric. And then if you could also take one, like we do with the seam. Now you can do this one on the, you can choose to do it with the smaller piece on top, or you could do it with the gathered piece. It really doesn't matter to me. I just want to make sure that I can see that seam. So you'll give me 3 shots there, sorry. And then you'll do again a shot from the inside, a shot from the outside, and then however you want to do it, just 1 shot of the seam there. It's going to look a little funky from either side, whichever side you do it from, you can decide what you want. Okay, I hope that's pretty easy.